Please welcome to the stage Aime Williams from the Financial Times, Ajay Banga of the World Bank Group, and Dr. Rajiv J. Shah of the Rockefeller Foundation.
Hi, thank you, and welcome to our panel on advancing the energy transition in low and middle income countries through innovative partnerships. We already know who both of these panelists are, but we have Raj Shah, president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and Ajay Banga, president of the World Bank. Without further ado, I want to go straight to you, Ajay. Could you tell us a bit about your M300 project to connect more people in Africa to electricity?
So M300 is basically the commitment made by us and the African Development Bank to connect 300 million people in Africa to renewable electricity by 2030. The history, the background is that there are 600 million people in Africa without any access to electricity. And that gives us what we take for granted: healthcare, education, jobs, safety, schooling. Everything depends on electricity and what it enables. And so I think if you focus on the topic of trying to change the livelihoods and the quality of life for Africans, that's where this idea came from. The reality is, I think of electricity as a human right, and I think, therefore, getting it delivered to these people is important. You can't do it alone. That's why the idea of partnerships. It connects to the bigger idea of enabling people to have the dignity of a job and enabling that. What we're trying to do right now is to work with 15 African countries and get them to line up into an energy compact, which describes what are they going to do differently with regulatory policy, with connecting regional markets for electricity trading, with fixing the utilities and the like. And then what can we do to put money there? The World Bank is going to put in about 25 billion from something called IDA, the International Development Association, that leverages every dollar from donors 4 times. We're going to put money in from the private sector and work with them. We've got to get money from the IMF to help the fiscal situation of these countries. And then the most important topic of why we're on this table together and the space together is because you also need all shoulders at the wheel. You need not just resources, you need capacity. And you need resources both concessional and just a blended finance. Raj has a unique approach to that, and his partnership, and there's another institution called Sustainable Energy for All. We're kind of all working in this together in an effort to make this happen. We've got a big summit coming up in Tanzania with 15 heads of state in January, the end of January, in an effort to align all the pieces in the puzzle and then see if we can roll it forward from there.
Raj, I want to come to you. You're keen to jump in here, I know, but could you tell us about why this partnership is important? Why does Ajay need the philanthropy to come
Why
in?
this fellow? Yeah,
Why does the World Bank need a philanthropy to come in and help with this? Why can't the World Bank just do this on its own?
I will try. First, let me say thank you, Amy, for having us, and thank you to the Concordia community that I know focuses so much on how we bring innovation and partnership to actually tackle these huge problems, right? And I think we glossed over at the beginning the basic concept of the idea that the World Bank is the most important financial institution when it comes to providing public finance to developing nations around the world. That was true 80 plus years ago. That is still true today. It's especially true in Africa, where right now, as we speak, more than 40 countries are spending more on their debt service obligations leaving the country than they are on either funding education or health for their own populations. So in that setting, when you say, hey, unless Africa and other developing economies broadly transition to renewable electrification, the entire global effort to fight climate change will be deeply undermined. Countries, you should help finance that transition. They don't have the resources to make that transition happen right now. And in that incredibly dire and challenging circumstance, Ajay steps in as a president of the World Bank and says, you know what? We're going to make a singular and massive commitment, together with his collaborator, Akin Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank, and they committed $30 billion of public finance to promoting this energy transition. And not just that huge amount of capital, also saying let's do it by a date certain, 2030, and let's set a quantitative target we can all measure. electrifying 300 million people so they can have jobs, they can have healthcare, they can have education, and they can lift up their living standards in a way that protects our planet. So that, in the history of how these institutions operate, that is a pretty bold leadership action, and I commend Ajay and Akin for making it. So then the next thing is, well, can they do it on their own? And the answer is no. All of this requires starting with countries themselves. So in Tanzania in January, 15 heads of state will sign compacts that specify the regulatory, policy, and domestic investment reforms they are committing to in order to yield this outcome. The development banks will, of course, commit their resources. But the truth is, in a modern global economy, you need to be public-private to make these things work. So the Rockefeller Foundation, the Bezos Earth Fund, the IKEA Foundation, probably 24 other partners are coming together in an alliance to support Mission 300. And our support is smaller dollar. It's technical assistance so that you can do a technical study and say, well, if you're going to cite 100 or 200 or 300 new grids that are going to be built out in a part of Nigeria, can we do that quickly, efficiently, and with a high degree of technical sophistication? It's using our resources to say, can we subsidize an investment in a piece of green infrastructure so private investors and local private investors are somewhat protected from the risks that come with making these investments in this current very difficult macroeconomy. And importantly, it's also saying, who's going to actually buy power from companies that will be enabled by this big Mission 300 project? It's farmers, it's health clinics, it's educational facilities. Can we help them utilize that energy access to actually create jobs and inclusive growth and lift living standards? And frankly, when we work together, we can track these outcomes, we can achieve things that are just extraordinary. So my message to the Concordia community is really twofold. One is, you should be all in on advocating your governments to fund IDA, the World Bank, at a very high level, because this is a signature effort made possible by IDA's financial capability. And second, we should all be working with the World Bank in public-private partnership as opposed to doing our own thing separately, because that's the only way we're going to actually reach 300 million people with renewable power.
The only thing I'd add to that is that the part about the technical assistance, people can get confused by that. It's very simple. If these countries had enough people to create the quality of projects that we would call bankable and get them executed, then they would not be in the circumstances they are today. Helping them get access to that technical capacity, which we can do. We're a money bank, but we're also a knowledge bank. But having that also with somebody like him and with Sustainable Energy for All, this other organization, and others, is what he's talking about. It's the multiplier effect of giving resources to people on the ground to help make a difference. And that's what we're trying to do. Not just make the pronouncement, not just bring the money, but have the detailed plans and the execution focus on the ground to get this done.
Right. Raj, I wanted to pick up on your point about private-public partnerships. Ajay, I know you've been talking about that from the moment you arrived at the World Bank. A broad question, but people talk a lot about this when they're talking about climate finance, and there are numbers in the trillions of dollars needed right, for the energy transition in the global south, climate resilience, adaptation, so on and so forth. How do you get more of this private money flowing to the global south? Because this is a great start, but as you know, so much more is needed.
So I mean, you can get bogged down by those very large numbers that are required. And we at the World Bank, when I took over, I said in COP28, actually, I made a commitment that we'd get to 45% of our financing going to climate by 2025, next year. Half for adaptation, half for mitigation. We're basically at 44 already this year. So we'll cross that number. But all the multilateral banks put together doesn't add up to those trillions that you need. Government money doesn't add up to those trillions. Governments are busy paying other things. So you need the private sector because that's the only consistent place the money will come from. Now, the reality is that solar and wind per unit are now cheaper to produce than fossil fuel, particularly if you go past the slightly longer gestation period that is involved in putting these up, and you get the transmission and connectivity and technology done. If you do all that and they're cheaper, why is it that money is not rushing into at least the middle-income countries, where the risks are supposedly lower? Why is it not rushing in to transform their generation mix over time? And the reality is if we don't rush into the middle income countries, all the work you do in the developed world on reducing the mix of fossil fuel in your energy, that'll get eaten up by the growth of the middle income countries and their populations, which is their right. So the question then is, how do you change this, bend this curve? And we created a private sector lab with Mark Carney and Shriti and 15 CEOs from operators and asset managers, Larry Fink and HSBC and Tata's in India and a bunch of others. We've learned 5 things. The first is what they need is clarity of regulatory policy. If they don't get that, they will take their money and park it elsewhere. And when you have things like the IRA or European subsidies, the desire for investment to go to a riskier country than to more predictable countries with government support, you can feel the difference. So regulatory policy clarity is number 1, 2, and 3. The second is even if they get that, they need political risk guarantees. There we can help. We have an institution called MEGA that does for a living. We put the platform together. It's all working. It's already growing in large numbers. The third big thing they want is we should take first loss, meaning IFC, which is our private sector working arm, if we take the first loss, point of that Raj was saying about concessional capital, the other side of that is we take the first loss, we improve for investors the look on their spreadsheet of their risk. But if I take a first loss and I actually book a loss, I've got to go back to my owners, my stakeholders, to get a capital reinjection. That's not a pleasant exercise. So how do you create a fund of some type, a first loss fund, to absorb the ups and downs of equity accounting and the losses you may take? That's another thing we're trying to fund, both from our own resources, but also from philanthropy.
So that's something you're actively
working on as we speak. The fourth item has to do with foreign exchange and local currency financing. Lots of work happening there. And the fifth one to me is the most interesting at scale. If you want to bring pension fund and asset management money to work to this topic, the trillions being there, you need to create a flow of projects that are standardized and blessed by rating agencies that a BlackRock or a Ontario Teachers Pension Plan could put large sums of money to work against and use it to turn the mix of their own investments. Today, if you do it project by project, each with bespoke guidelines, each done differently, there is no way that you're going to get to scale on that. That's a big task we're working on right now with rating agencies and a number of market-leading players to try and make that happen.
That's fascinating. Raj, you're
well,
not
I would just say, we spent 2 hours this morning with 30 partners from around the globe.
Together. At his office.
Just saying, look, how do we actually execute at scale and at pace? And it's exactly what Ajay said. The fact that now the World Bank, the African Development Bank, all these development agencies around the world and private partners are sharing data. They're saying, here are 130 priority projects that are ready to go as soon as countries sign these compacts and as soon as the regulatory framework is clear for how these projects can move forward. I was just in Nigeria a couple of months ago, sat with a group of developers. They said, look, we're eager to build out renewable energy for communities that are dependent on diesel and frankly, with the change in fossil fuel subsidies, are now spending 90 cents or more per kilowatt hour trying to power businesses with diesel generation. You can't build an economy that way. That's why there's a massive increase in the inflation and unemployment rate in Nigeria. They want power. The developers want to build it out. The infrastructure hasn't been there and the financing hasn't been there.
And the utilities are not.
And the utilities haven't been economically viable to substantiate the transition. So this new collaboration is making that transition possible. In that same dialogue, we then sat with pension funds, and they said, look, we'll put $1 billion of local capital on the table if you can help us structure this in a way that protects our investment in a reasonable manner, and you can use your philanthropic flexibility to help us identify the right developers and build it out per plan. The results are already on the ground, and they're already extraordinary. So scaling this up to reach 300 million people in Africa will frankly be the largest public-private partnership for climate or for inclusive development throughout the continent. And we absolutely have to get this right. That's our commitment to Ajay, to his extraordinary team at the bank, and to the 15 countries who've said this is the key aspect to building an inclusive and just economy.
There are some things that need to be done as well in the way all of us work together, which is part of what we're trying to do. But if, for example, I'm doing a project with the African Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank, let's say in Tanzania, to connect, 5 million people to renewable energy. And if the procurement standards of these institutions are different, then Tanzania's government has to go through 3 processes to get one thing done. 3 times to get their projects approved, 3 times to get their procurements approved. If they had 3 sets of people to do this stuff, they would be fine. They don't. And so the idea there is not to build their capacity. That's a bad answer. The idea there is to reduce your complexity and start working in a way that our procurement standards can be unified. So it's those kinds of things that get lost when you talk the big picture that actually are what we're focused on getting done with working groups that are really kicking things around the table to fix them.
I was wondering what you also made as a source of private finance of carbon credits and carbon markets. This is like a very hot topic at the moment. I know you've both done some work on it.
Yeah.
Could you both kind of tell me, is this real? Is this going to work? Like, what are we doing here?
I'll go. Well, actually, I'll speak about carbon markets in a moment. Before we pivot off the answer Ajay was just giving you, I do have a special request for those in the philanthropic community. Philanthropy is now a fairly sizable component of global development work and investment. And the challenge is too often institutions in that sector, want to be really hyper intelligent about every specific grant that's made and do things quite independently. And I would just argue that much like the global health space transformed itself 20 years ago to fight HIV/AIDS at scale, to fight malaria at scale, to vaccinate 1 billion children and save 20 million lives by working together, the green energy transition is never going to happen. It's never going to be just, and it's never going to provide jobs, especially to the 1 billion people who live in extreme poverty and deprivation, unless we come together and work together in a spirit of collaboration. So we are open. Part of why we're here is for Mission 300 is we want more philanthropic partners. There's room for everybody to contribute intellectually and contribute operationally to this effort. Please reach out to Ajay or myself so you can be a part of that. On the carbon credits piece, I personally do think of that as a very important component of long-term financing for this transformation. If you're building out renewable infrastructure in lieu of coal, the transition in terms of what you're doing for carbon on the planet is clear, it's measurable, it's robust, you can document it, and if it's done in a context that understands what else is happening in the nearby environment, it can be very, very, very high quality. Today, there are lots of carbon credits sold already in far less rigorous of a framework of quality, measurement, and durability. So we have to figure this out in order to make sure that there's investable opportunities for carbon credit financing to support this transition.
So let me tell you what we're doing. I agree with them completely. First of all, I think the idea of taxes on carbon is interesting, but it creates distortion, number one. And number two, the thought that you can tax somebody in Milwaukee to send the money to Timbuktu is not a good political solution. And I think we need to just get past that discussion and start talking about voluntary carbon money moving. That's what credits come in use for. They're currently trading at an obnoxiously low price of $6 to $8. That is crazy. You ask anybody what the price should be, it should be multiples of that. What we are trying to do is 2 tactical things, one a little more strategic. The tactical ones are, we are working with the government of Singapore on creating a carbon credit registry so that you can have a tracking method. 2, we are working with a number of countries, 30 countries in all, to help them understand how to track carbon credits. So kind of you create that process. On the other side, where we are involved in the forestry project, starting with forestry, we will do an environmental audit and a social audit. Environmental meaning don't grow trees here to cut them down there. And social meaning the money should go to the community, not the government, because otherwise when you turn your back, they'll cut the tree down. Because they're not cutting the tree down for useless reasons. They're doing it for economic reasons. So you have to solve the economic issue if you're going to make progress on this. If we can certify those credits, we think we can get about 125 million credits from 15 countries in the coming period. I'm hoping with a seal of good housekeeping, maybe we can translate this into a better price. That's where we're trying to go.
Okay. Well, I could keep asking you both questions all day, but unfortunately I'm not allowed, and we have to wrap up our panel here. But thank you so much for both joining us and having this fascinating discussion.
Thank you. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.
You're welcome.